Mr. President.
Senator from Maryland.
Thank you, Mr. President. I think everybody in this body now knows that yesterday, President Biden convened a meeting at the White House to discuss how the United States would avoid a default on the country, a default on our debt, a default which would be something that's never happened before in the history of the country. The 14th Amendment, Section 4 says, and I'm quoting, "The validity of the public debt of the United States authorized by law, including debts incurred for payment of pensions and bounties for services, shall not be questioned." Shall not be questioned. Throughout our history, in good times and bad times, we have always met our obligations as a country. And that's why President Biden wanted to bring together the congressional leaders to discuss making sure that we don't do that for the first time. He was joined, of course, by Speaker McCarthy. He was joined by the minority leader from the House, Congressman Jeffries. From the Senate, he was joined by Majority Leader Schumer and Republican Leader McConnell. I was asked earlier today whether I felt better in the aftermath of this meeting having taken place. And I said I am glad that the leaders plan to meet again on Friday. But no, I don't feel more comfortable or confident today than I did before the meeting. And the reason is this: because Speaker McCarthy continues to threaten to default on America's debts unless he and the MAGA Republicans in the House can impose big parts of their agenda on the country, impose their agenda on the American people. I just want to unpack for a moment what exactly that means. What exactly is Speaker McCarthy saying to the country? And he's saying this, that if the Senate doesn't go along with the very extreme proposals passed by the House Republicans, and if the president doesn't agree to sign on to those extreme proposals, he will allow the United States, for the first time in our history, to default on our obligations. And what does that mean? It means he is threatening economic catastrophe, because there's no dispute among Republicans. I don't care if you're a Democratic economist or a Republican economist. Economists across the board will tell you that a default would be catastrophic for our economy. Massive job losses. We saw an estimate the other day of 8 million jobs lost in the country. Retirement nest eggs that people have been working a lifetime to build up, imploding. Interest rates rising. The credibility of America around the world shattered. The dollar as the world's reserve currency being called into question. I can tell you who will be celebrating if this happens, and that's the folks in Beijing, the PRC. They'll be very happy if the United States undermines its credibility on the world stage, and they'll be very happy if we lose our position of having the dollar being the world's reserve currency. So what was President Biden's response? So what the president is saying, and I want to be clear what he's saying, hold on, Mr. Speaker, hold on, Speaker McCarthy. You know, paying our bills on time is not just a Democratic obligation. It's not a Republican obligation. It's not an independence obligation. It's an obligation of Uncle Sam. These are obligations the United States has built up during Democratic presidencies and Republican presidencies. In fact, if you look at the record during the 4 years of the Trump administration, we accumulated 1/4 of the total debt owed by the United States today. And yet during those 4 years, the House and the Senate, without drama, said, yes, the United States is committed to paying its debts and will do so and will address the debt ceiling in that manner. And just to emphasize once again, what we're talking about is obligations the United States has already incurred, that we've already said as a country, we will do this. We will pay your Social Security. We will pay your Medicare. We will pay our veterans. We will pay our obligations as a country, including those who have purchased U.S. Treasury bonds. That's what we said when we passed those things, and it's important that we keep our word. So what President Biden says is, look, these are Uncle Sam's obligations. Mr. Speaker, you don't get to come in here and threaten the health of the American economy if you and House Republicans don't get to enact your policies, don't get to enact your agenda. So take your finger, Mr. Speaker, off the default detonator, and then we should talk about issues of common concern. We can talk about the budget. We can talk about the deficit and debt. We can talk about spending. We can talk about revenue. And in fact, President Biden has submitted to the House and Senate his budget proposal. I serve on the Senate Budget Committee. We as the Senate have received that. President Biden has proposed a budget that achieves $3 trillion in deficit reduction over the next 10 years. The proposal passed by Speaker McCarthy and Republicans in the House achieves about $4.5 trillion in deficit reduction over 10 years. So what the President is saying to Speaker McCarthy and House Republicans is, we're happy to sit down as part of the normal budget process, happy to talk as part of the normal appropriations process about how we can address the deficit and the debt. I put forward my proposal, you put forward a proposal, let's sit down. But President Biden is not saying, Speaker McCarthy, he isn't saying this to Speaker McCarthy. He's not saying that you've got to reduce the deficit by $3 trillion the way I, President Biden, have done it. And if you don't agree to my proposal for reducing the deficit by $3 trillion, then I'm not going to sign a bill to raise the debt ceiling. And if President Biden said that, people would say he's crazy. And it would be very irrational. But that's exactly what Speaker McCarthy and House Republicans are doing. They're saying, Mr. President, if you don't reduce the deficit our way, we're going to blow up the American economy. So let's step back from the brink here. Speaker McCarthy, take your finger off the default detonator, and let's have a discussion about how to reduce the deficits and debt. Because when you do that, you understand that many of our Republican colleagues really don't care that much about the deficit and debt. Why do I say that? Because if you say, let's reduce the deficit and debt by increasing revenue, by asking some of the wealthiest people in the country, billionaires, people who make hundreds of millions of dollars every year, if you say, let's reduce the deficit by asking them to pay more in terms of taxes, you won't get any support from our Republican colleagues, the same folks who say it is absolutely urgent that we reduce our deficit and debt. But we know there are two sides of the equation. There's spending and there's revenue. And in fact, if you go back to the last time that the United States balanced our budget, which is around the year 2000, you will find that revenues as a share of our GDP, revenues as a share of our economy, were about 20%. Today, if you look forward to the next couple of years, the projections are total revenues will be about 18% of our economy. Now, the difference between 18% revenues as a share of our economy at 20% may not sound like a big number, but 2% of a very big American economy is a lot of revenue. So what President Biden is saying is, you know, the last time we actually balanced our budget, revenue as a share of GDP was 20%. So at least let's look at that as a contribution. Let's look at raising the top rate on corporations to a level that would still be lower than it was just 10 years ago, but higher than it is today. And all this talk about the IRS agents, you know, Republicans say, let's get rid of the additional funds to support IRS agents. These are IRS agents that are going to go after very rich tax deadbeats. And in fact, the Congressional Budget Office projects that if you invest in that effort to go after very rich tax deadbeats, you actually raise revenue. So the action that the House took in this regard actually increased the deficit and is just protecting folks who make a boatload of money from paying the taxes that are already due and owing. So what President Biden has said is, okay, sit back, let's talk through the normal budget and appropriations process, but don't threaten to blow up the American economy. And President Biden's budget also has cuts in it. In fact, what the president has proposed is that the Medicare program pay Big Pharma, pay the pharmaceutical industry, a little less for the drugs that the Medicare program purchases. After all of us in this room and every American citizen contribute billions and billions of dollars every year to really important work done at the National Institutes of Health, which is headquartered in my state of Maryland. It's an American treasure. It is an amazing place, and it's a great engine of invention. We spend billions and billions of dollars in taxpayer every year for them to do research that has uncovered really important cures and really important treatments and helped the pharmaceutical industry develop a lot of the drugs. And yet, Big Pharma uses the research developed with taxpayer dollars and then often turns around and sells those drugs at prices that American taxpayers can't afford. And so what President Biden has proposed is that they take a little less, we give them even more, we give the Medicare program even more negotiating authority so that we can reduce those costs to Medicare and to the taxpayer. So he's proposed those kind of cuts. I know a lot of our Republican colleagues don't like those ideas, but that's why you come to the table. That's why Speaker McCarthy should accept President Biden's invitation to come to the table to discuss in the normal course, in the budget and the appropriations process, how we can address issues of the deficit. What are our priorities? What should we do on the revenue side? What should we do on the spending? It was very bad in 2011. We came very close to going over the waterfall. The markets got very jittery. Interest rates did begin to creep up. It cost the U.S. government more to meet our obligations. And I'm more worried this time because we apparently have a lot more folks in the House of Representatives who don't seem to fully appreciate and understand the disastrous consequences of default for American families, for our economy. So I remember back in 2011, it was right after the 2010 elections, Republicans had won a big majority in the House of Representatives. President Obama was in the White House. And they were threatening early on to hold the issue of default and threaten to use it for budget purposes. And it's true. I mean, we've heard it said that Vice President Biden at the time came down to the Hill and they formed what was called the Biden Group. And they met in an office right around the corner here on this floor of the United States Senate. I was one of the House members that participated in that. There were a total of about 10 from the House, Senate, Republicans, and Democrats. We had at least 10 meetings. And Vice President Biden would begin each meeting this way. He would say, I know today we're going to talk about the cuts that are being proposed by House Republicans. And we'll do that. But I want you to know two things. One is nothing's agreed to until everything's agreed to. And after we go through these proposed cuts, we're going to go through proposed revenue increases. We're going to close tax loopholes for very wealthy people. And so we're going to attack the deficit from both sides of the equation. We'll do some cuts, but you've also got to be prepared to talk about revenue. And everybody at the table nodded their heads. Senate Republicans, House Republicans, Democrats. Well, after 10 meetings of discussing cuts, a lot of us were getting concerned that we hadn't really begun to dig into revenues. And Vice President Biden said, you know, I've said at the beginning of every meeting, we got to get to revenues. We're going to do that. And at that moment, the talks broke down. Eric Cantor, who was the majority leader in the House at the time, Speaker Boehner was Speaker, Kevin McCarthy walked out of the talks, largely because he was afraid he was going to be fingered by his House Republican colleagues for having agreed to talk about revenues. Imagine that. You care about the deficit, but you won't talk about any ways to raise even a penny of revenue from very wealthy people. And so that sort of exposed the whole charade at the time. And so now Joe Biden is president of the United States. I'm sure he's thinking about those days when he served as the head of that budget group. And I'm sure he's thinking back to the fact that when our Republican colleagues came to the table and said they cared about deficit reduction and all nodded their heads and said, yeah, after we talk about cuts, we're going to talk about revenues, and then walked out of the room when that moment came, that just shows that what we're dealing with here is not a commitment to deal with the deficit and debt. What we're talking about is a power play to threaten the health of the American economy in order to impose the MAGA House agenda. And President Biden is absolutely right to say, I'm more than willing to talk about the budget and deficits and fiscal policy, but first, Mr. Speaker, take your finger off the default detonator. That's what Mr. McCarthy needs to do, and then we can deal with this in a way that the country deserves. I yield my time. Mr. President, I have 10 requests for committees to meet during today's session of the Senate. They have the approval of the majority and minority leaders.
Duly noted.
I yield my time.